Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. Malcolm's parents, Earl and Louise Little, were a part of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. This influenced the couple's 7 children to be self-reliant and sparked within them a desire to uplift and advance all people of African descent. During Malcolm's school years, he was an honor student and even became class president in the 8th grade. However, with the death of his father at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan, his mother being committed to a mental institution, and by one of his teachers telling Malcolm that his dream of becoming a lawyer was unrealistic for a colored boy, led Malcolm to become discouraged, and ultimately he dropped out of school. Malcolm went on to live with his half-sister in Roxbury, a largely African-American neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts. In 1943, he moved to Harlem, New York, where he worked as a waiter. Soon after, Malcolm became involved with gambling, drug dealing, and pimping. In 1945, Malcolm moved back to Boston, where he, along with 4 other accomplices, began burglarizing wealthy white homes. Malcolm's petty thefts eventually caught up with him, and in 1946 he was arrested and sentenced to 8 to 10 years at Charleston State Prison on the charges of larceny and breaking and entering. It would be during the span of his incarceration that Malcolm first heard of Elijah Muhammad and his teachings, as well as the religion of Islam. Elijah Muhammad was the leader of the black religious organization known as the Nation of Islam, whose leader today is Louis Farrakhan. Malcolm's brothers wrote to him in jail about the natural religion for the black man, a religion that taught that black people were the original people of the earth. They told Malcolm that they were now part of the Nation of Islam and followed the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the messenger of Allah. Already indoctrinated by the teachings of Marcus Garvey, Malcolm's siblings did not need to be converted to black pride. They were already in that frame of mind when they entered the nation. So after serving 6.5 years in prison, Malcolm was released and soon joined the Nation of Islam. Now Malcolm Little would be known as Malcolm X. Elijah Muhammad's mission was to restore the American so-called Negro's knowledge of his own God, the knowledge of the Supreme Being whose name was Allah. Elijah Muhammad taught that the white man was evil by nature and that the white man was responsible for all the sufferings that blacks in America have experienced. However, the reform of the white man was not the focus of Elijah Muhammad. His focus was to reform and re-educate the black man in America. An identity that links one to a country, nation, or culture was needed for blacks living in America who had roots in the continent of Africa. Malcolm helped to officially recognize blacks in America as African American or Afro American. For previously, blacks in America used the term Negro to identify themselves. Now the English word Negro means black in Spanish, which comes from the Greek word nekron meaning death. So collectively, the word Negro means something that is black and dead. The title of a people whose description means dead and black would just not do. Once Malcolm was brought into the Nation of Islam's inner circle, he became Elijah Muhammad's most prominent representative. Malcolm had found another father, and Elijah Muhammad had found another son. So Elijah Muhammad sent Malcolm to spread the message, and within 2 years, he helped establish many mosques along the East Coast. Witnessing Malcolm's success, Elijah Muhammad made Malcolm minister of Harlem's Temple No. 7, the most high-profile black Muslim mosque on the East Coast. In order to reach more black Americans and to expand the nation's members, Malcolm started a newspaper called Muhammad Speaks, which was a project he worked on diligently. At age 32, Malcolm married a woman who was also in the Nation of Islam, Betty X, who in the years that followed would bear Malcolm 6 children, all girls. As the civil rights movement called for integration, Malcolm believed that black people were capable of solving their own problems without the help of whites, calling on the ideals and tenets of the Pan-African movement. After a fatal altercation with police at a black mosque in Los Angeles, Malcolm began to speak less of how Allah was going to deal with the white man and more of how blacks were going to bring whites to justice. For in the 1960s, the police used water cannons against black demonstrators and turned their dogs on them. These actions by the white authorities gave the Nation of Islam a more legitimate charge against the white man as a devil. Though he was critical of the racism displayed by whites towards people of color, Malcolm himself was not a racist. Malcolm was for the brotherhood of all, but at the same time he was against forcing brotherhood on those who did not want it. Malcolm did not preach violence, he preached self-defense, but most of the time this difference was glossed over by the press, and his message was labeled as hate speech. He was militant, but militant in defending oneself from the aggressor, for as it is written in the Quran, quote, "Fight in the way of Allah against those who fight against you, but be not aggressive. Surely Allah does not love the aggressors." Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 190. And though Malcolm was a serious man, he also had a beautiful sense of humor, and those that knew him said he could even be a bit shy at times. Now Malcolm had committed himself to Elijah Muhammad and submitted himself to his authority, but when Malcolm found out that Elijah Muhammad had fathered 8 children by 6 of his personal teenage secretaries, Malcolm lost all respect for his teacher. When Malcolm began to speak openly about Elijah Muhammad's philandering, the Nation of Islam feared that if Malcolm remained in the black Muslim movement and the truth about Elijah Muhammad came to light, then Elijah Muhammad's followers would abandon him and start to follow Malcolm. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm announced that he was leaving the Nation of Islam. He then formed a new religious organization called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated for any that wished to follow him. However, Malcolm knew that a rival black mosque would be seen as a direct challenge to the authority of Elijah Muhammad. In April of 1964, Malcolm traveled to Mecca to make the Hajj, a pilgrimage required of all Muslims. While in Mecca, Malcolm saw the respect and brotherhood displayed between the pilgrims of all colors, a spirit of unity that he had never seen before. After returning from his pilgrimage to the Middle East and Africa, Malcolm related that he had close contact with Muslims that were white, but that these white Muslims he met in Mecca were different from the whites in America. For one thing, they did not look at themselves as white, but as a part of the human family, and looked upon all other segments of the human family as a part of that same family. Malcolm said the white Muslims he met in Mecca had a different attitude than the attitude reflected in the white man of America. At the Audubon Ballroom, located in Harlem, Malcolm announced the formation of a political group modeled after the Organization of African Unity, which was based in the continent of Africa. Malcolm's group would be called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, with the aspiration to bring about the complete independence of all people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere and to ensure their freedom by any means necessary. For in the 1960s, the only voice in America that spoke of the disparity of the Africans in Africa was Malcolm X. For Malcolm's message was not solely for blacks in America, but for the entire African diaspora. In early February 1965, Malcolm was invited to speak in Selma, Alabama. It was the first time he traveled to the South to work with the civil rights movement. However, it was at this time that the members of the Nation of Islam started to become violent towards Malcolm and his family. For on the night of February the 14th, 1965, Malcolm's house was firebombed with him, his wife, and children all inside. Fortunately, no one was killed. The Nation of Islam would go on to accuse Malcolm of bombing his own house rather than vacating the premises as ordered by the court. Malcolm knew his life was in danger, and he planned to reveal the names of those who were plotting his death at a meeting at the Audubon Ballroom on the following week on February the 21st, 1965. Malcolm made it to the Audubon that day, but would not live long enough to reveal the names of those who were planning his assassination, for those assassins would soon make their move. When the first shot was fired, Betty, Malcolm's wife, said she saw him fall straight back without bending. One of Malcolm's daughters remembers facing the assassins as they took her father's life. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were arrested and later convicted with the murder of Malcolm X. However, many believe that the men who went to prison were innocent and that there was a larger conspiracy surrounding the assassination of Malcolm X. Both during his life and after his death, Malcolm's message has been misinterpreted, which has resulted in infinite complications. But despite the various analysis of his words, Malcolm's character and integrity have outshined his critics. Just as he was an advocate for the uplifting of his fellow Africans, Malcolm believed in the brotherhood of all people. He was a voice of all those who had suffered from injustice, racism, and oppression. Despite his death, Malcolm would go on to become one of the most influential people of the 20th century. Though bullets may have destroyed his body, no weapon yet has had the power to silence his message. Close friend Ossie Davis had this to say of Malcolm. Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood, and in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. This is the Leap of Faith.